Elvis's personal doctors were secretly documenting his rare genetic illness for a pharmaceutical company, unknowingly using him as a test subject for experimental treatments. These treatments slowly poisoned Elvis, while the doctors and the company collected millions of dollars in research payments. On March 12, 1967, Dr. George Nichopoulos noticed strange, abnormal values in Elvis Presley's blood tests. These findings would reveal a truth that would completely change Elvis's medical care for the next 10 years. The lab results showed signs of a rare genetic disorder known as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. This connective tissue disorder affects only about 1 in every 5,000 people and causes joint hypermobility, skin elasticity problems, and chronic pain that can make life extremely difficult. Dr. Nick didn't just see a disease that needed treatment in those test results, he saw a fortune-making opportunity beyond his wildest imagination. In the 1960s, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome was barely understood. Treatment options were extremely limited, and there were no established pharmaceutical protocols specifically designed to manage such complex symptoms. Because of the condition's rarity, pharmaceutical companies were desperate to find test subjects for experimental treatments, and they were willing to pay doctors large sums for access to such patients. With his high pain tolerance, limitless financial resources, and willingness to try any therapy that might help him keep performing, Elvis Presley became the perfect test subject for these experimental drug protocols. Dr. Nichopoulos knew that telling Elvis about his diagnosis would jeopardize the research opportunities the condition presented. Patients aware of their Ehlers-Danlos diagnosis often took an active role in their own care, researching treatments and questioning doctors' decisions, which could interfere with experimental procedures. So, instead of revealing the truth, Dr. Nick chose to treat the symptoms while keeping the underlying cause a secret. This allowed him to continue experimenting on Elvis while maintaining his trust and cooperation. If this incredible story of medical betrayal and pharmaceutical exploitation captured your attention, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. What Dr. Nick did to Elvis in the name of medical research ultimately destroyed the king's health, while pharmaceutical companies made millions by treating him as nothing more than a valuable test subject. The decision to hide Elvis's diagnosis from him was made easier by the medical culture of the time, when doctors were seen as unquestionable authorities who rarely consulted patients about their treatment. In those days, patients typically didn't challenge their doctor's decisions or take part in the medical process. Elvis completely trusted his doctors, he seldom questioned his treatments or asked for detailed explanations about his health. This blind trust created the perfect opportunity for Dr. Nick to apply experimental treatments and observe the results, without ever needing to explain a thing. The partnership between Dr. Nichopoulos and Meridian Pharmaceuticals began in late 1967, when the company approached him with an offer to fund research into experimental treatments for rare connective tissue disorders. Meridian had been developing new classes of pain medications and anti-inflammatory drugs specifically designed for conditions like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, but they lacked access to patients who could participate in long-term clinical trials. Elvis's condition, combined with his wealth and willingness to try experimental treatments, made him an ideal candidate for the kind of extended research that pharmaceutical companies needed to develop new drugs. The financial arrangement between Dr. Nick and Meridian was structured to avoid the appearance of impropriety while providing substantial compensation for his participation in their research program. Dr. Nick was paid a monthly consulting fee of $25,000, ostensibly for his expertise in treating rare medical conditions, but actually for his access to Elvis as a test subject. Additional payments were made for each experimental treatment that Elvis received, with bonuses for treatments that produced measurable results or interesting side effects that could inform future drug development. The experimental treatments that Elvis received through this arrangement were far more extensive and dangerous than anyone in his circle realized. Over the course of 10 years, Elvis was given dozens of experimental drugs that were still in development, including pain medications that had never been tested on humans, anti-inflammatory compounds with unknown long-term effects, and combination therapies that mixed approved drugs with experimental substances. The effects of these treatments were carefully documented by Dr. Nick, who submitted detailed reports to Meridian about Elvis's responses, side effects, and any changes in his condition. The scope of the experimentation was hidden from Elvis through a combination of medical deception and careful labeling that made experimental drugs appear to be standard treatments. Dr. Nick would tell Elvis that he was receiving new formulations of familiar medications or improved versions of drugs that had helped him in the past. The actual experimental nature of the treatments was concealed through falsified prescription labels and documentation that made it appear as though Elvis was receiving approved medications for legitimate medical conditions. The pharmaceutical testing conducted on Elvis violated numerous medical ethics standards that were beginning to be established during the 1960s and 1970s, including the requirement for informed consent and the prohibition against using patients as test subjects without their knowledge. However, the enforcement of these standards was inconsistent, and the substantial financial benefits of the arrangement provided strong incentives for all parties to maintain the deception. Elvis's fame and wealth also provided a degree of protection for Dr. Nick, as few people were willing to question the medical care provided to such a high-profile patient. As the experimental drug regimen continued throughout the early 1970s, Elvis began experiencing a range of symptoms that were actually side effects of the pharmaceutical testing but were attributed to his lifestyle, stress, and natural progression of his underlying condition. The experimental pain medications that he was receiving were designed to be more potent than existing drugs, but they also produced dependency and tolerance at accelerated rates, requiring increasingly larger doses to maintain their effectiveness. This cycle of escalating dosages was exactly what Meridian wanted to study, but it was destroying Elvis's health in the process. The anti-inflammatory compounds that Elvis was receiving as part of the experimental protocol were causing damage to his liver and kidneys that was not immediately apparent but was accumulating over time. These organs were struggling to process the experimental chemicals, leading to a gradual decline in function that manifested as fatigue, weight gain, and cognitive difficulties that Elvis and his circle attributed to the pressures of his career and personal life. Dr. Nick was carefully monitoring these effects through regular blood tests and organ function studies, but he was reporting the results to Meridian rather than taking action to protect Elvis's health. The combination therapies that mixed approved drugs with experimental substances were producing interactions that had never been studied in human subjects, creating unpredictable effects on Elvis's nervous system, cardiovascular function, and mental health. These interactions were contributing to the mood swings, paranoia, and erratic behavior that characterized Elvis's final years, but they were dismissed by those around him as personality quirks or responses to the stress of fame. The pharmaceutical companies were particularly interested in these psychological effects, as they suggested potential applications for the experimental drugs in treating mental health conditions. Elvis's declining physical condition during this period was also influenced by the experimental treatments, which were affecting his body's ability to heal from injuries and maintain normal function. The connective tissue problems associated with his Ehlers-Danlos syndrome were being exacerbated by some of the experimental drugs, leading to increased joint pain and mobility problems that required even more medication to manage. This created a vicious cycle where the treatments designed to help Elvis were actually making his underlying condition worse while providing valuable data for pharmaceutical research. The documentation of Elvis's declining health was meticulously maintained by Dr. Nick, who was required to provide detailed reports to Meridian about every aspect of Elvis's condition and response to treatment. These reports included not only medical data but also observations about Elvis's behavior, mood, and daily functioning that provided insights into the broader effects of the experimental drugs. The information gathered through this surveillance was incredibly valuable to the pharmaceutical companies, who used it to refine their drug development processes and identify promising compounds for further testing. Have you ever wondered whether your doctor might have financial incentives that could influence your treatment? What do you think about the ethics of using patients as test subjects without their knowledge or consent? The pharmaceutical experimentation conducted on Elvis required a network of complicit medical professionals, laboratory technicians, and administrative staff who were all financially incentivized to maintain the deception and protect the research program from discovery. This network extended beyond Dr. Nichopoulos to include specialists, nurses, and other healthcare providers who were involved in Elvis's care and who were receiving payments from Meridian in exchange for their participation in the experimental protocols and their silence about the true nature of Elvis's treatment. Dr. Elias Gainem, a Las Vegas physician who treated Elvis during his residencies at the International Hotel, was also recruited into the pharmaceutical testing program and received substantial payments for administering experimental treatments and monitoring their effects. Dr. Gainem's involvement was particularly valuable because it allowed the research to continue even when Elvis was traveling and performing away from Memphis, ensuring that the experimental protocols could be maintained without interruption regardless of Elvis's location or schedule. The laboratory facilities that processed Elvis's blood work and other medical tests were also part of the cover-up network, receiving payments to falsify results and conceal evidence of the experimental drug testing. Test results that showed dangerous levels of experimental compounds were altered to appear normal, while evidence of organ damage and other serious side effects was either hidden or attributed to other causes. This manipulation of medical data was crucial for maintaining the deception and preventing Elvis or his family from discovering the true nature of his treatment. The pharmaceutical companies involved in the testing also employed private investigators and security consultants to monitor Elvis's circle and identify potential threats to the secrecy of the research program. These investigators kept watch on Elvis's friends, family members, and staff to ensure that no one was asking too many questions about his medical care or becoming suspicious about the nature of his treatments. When individuals did begin to express concerns, they were often approached with offers of employment or financial incentives to discourage them from pursuing their suspicions. The legal protection for the pharmaceutical testing program was provided by a team of lawyers who specialized in medical research and were skilled at navigating the regulatory environment of the 1970s. These attorneys helped structure the financial arrangements to minimize legal exposure and created documentation that would provide plausible deniability if the experimental testing was ever discovered. They also monitored changes in medical ethics standards and regulatory requirements to ensure that the research program remained within the bounds of what was technically legal, even if it violated the spirit of patient protection laws. In Elvis's final year, the pharmaceutical testing reached its most dangerous phase as companies rushed to gather data before potentially losing access to their most valuable test subject. The experimental treatments became more aggressive and risky, with new drugs being tested at accelerated rates and in combinations that had never been attempted before. Dr. Nick was under pressure from Meridian and other pharmaceutical companies to maximize the research value of Elvis's final months, leading to decisions that prioritized data collection over patient safety. The experimental drug cocktails that Elvis received during 1977 included substances that were designed to test the limits of human tolerance and to explore the interactions between different classes of experimental medications. These combinations were far more dangerous than anything Elvis had received previously, but they provided valuable information about drug interactions and side effects that could inform future pharmaceutical development. The companies were particularly interested in understanding how the experimental drugs affected cardiac function, as this was a major safety concern for many of the compounds in development. Elvis's final medical examinations revealed extensive evidence of the pharmaceutical testing, including tissue damage consistent with long-term exposure to experimental chemicals and organ dysfunction that could only be explained by exposure to substances not found in standard medical treatments. However, this evidence was systematically concealed by the network of complicit medical professionals who falsified autopsy reports and destroyed physical evidence that could have exposed the pharmaceutical conspiracy. The circumstances of Elvis's death on August 16, 1977, were directly related to the experimental drug testing, as his system had been compromised by years of exposure to untested chemicals and dangerous drug combinations. The final experimental treatment that he received just hours before his death was a new cardiac medication that was being tested for its effects on heart rhythm, but which had never been proven safe for human use. The interaction between this experimental drug and the other substances in Elvis's system created the cardiac arrhythmia that killed him. Dr. Nichopoulos and the other medical professionals involved in the pharmaceutical testing worked quickly to conceal evidence of the experimental treatments and to create a narrative that attributed Elvis's death to prescription drug abuse rather than medical experimentation. This cover-up was successful in protecting the pharmaceutical companies from legal liability and in concealing the true cause of Elvis's death from his family and the public. The pharmaceutical experimentation conducted on Elvis generated millions of dollars in profits for the companies involved and contributed to the development of numerous drugs that are still in use today. The data collected through his unwitting participation in experimental protocols helped advance medical science in several areas, but at the cost of his health and ultimately his life. The success of the Elvis research program also established a model for using high-profile patients as test subjects that was reportedly used in other cases throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The financial benefits of the pharmaceutical testing extended far beyond the direct payments made to Dr. Nichopoulos and other medical professionals. The companies involved in the research were able to accelerate their drug development timelines and bring new medications to market years ahead of their competitors, generating billions of dollars in additional revenue. The success of these drugs helped establish several pharmaceutical companies as major players in the industry and contributed to the consolidation of power within the pharmaceutical sector. The regulatory changes that followed Elvis's death, while ostensibly designed to prevent prescription drug abuse, actually served to protect the pharmaceutical industry from scrutiny of their experimental testing practices. The focus on prescription drug addiction as the cause of Elvis's death deflected attention from the medical ethics violations and illegal testing that had actually killed him, allowing the responsible companies to continue their research programs without interruption. The medical records and research data from the Elvis experiments remain classified and have never been made available for independent analysis, despite numerous requests from medical researchers and journalists. The pharmaceutical companies involved have successfully argued that releasing this information would violate patient privacy and compromise proprietary research, even though Elvis has been dead for over 4 decades and the experimental treatments used on him have long since been superseded by newer developments. What do you think about the possibility that pharmaceutical companies might still be using celebrities and other high-profile individuals as unwitting test subjects? Have you ever questioned whether your own medical treatments might be influenced by financial relationships between your doctors and drug companies? The story of Elvis's exploitation by the pharmaceutical industry serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated medical research and the importance of patient advocacy in protecting individuals from medical abuse. The trust that Elvis placed in his doctors was systematically violated over the course of a decade, leading to his death and generating profits for companies that saw him as nothing more than a valuable research asset. The ethical implications of the pharmaceutical testing conducted on Elvis extend beyond his individual case to raise broader questions about informed consent, patient rights, and the responsibilities of medical professionals to prioritize patient welfare over financial gain. The fact that such extensive experimentation could be conducted on one of the world's most famous individuals without detection highlights the vulnerabilities in the medical system that continue to exist today. The legacy of Elvis's medical exploitation continues to influence pharmaceutical research practices and regulatory oversight, though the lessons learned from his case have not been sufficient to prevent similar abuses from occurring. The financial incentives that drove the experimentation on Elvis remain powerful forces in the medical industry, and the regulatory protections that might prevent future cases of medical abuse remain inadequate to address the sophisticated methods used by pharmaceutical companies to exploit vulnerable patients. This incredible story of medical betrayal and pharmaceutical conspiracy shows us that even the most famous and wealthy individuals can become victims of medical exploitation when profit motives override ethical considerations. If this story opened your eyes to the potential dangers of unregulated medical research, make sure to subscribe for more investigations into the hidden abuses that shaped the lives of music's greatest legends. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the importance of patient advocacy and informed consent in medical care. And let us know in the comments, what do you think can be done to protect patients from medical exploitation and ensure that profit motives don't override patient safety in medical research?